The Legend of Zelda is one of the most iconic series in all of gaming and also happens to be my personal favorite. I've set out to rank every main series game and compile the ultimate Zelda series ranking. In this video, we are looking at Link's bite-sized adventure, The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap. We will be scoring the game across these 10 categories. Each category will be scored from 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. Each category score is being chosen in relation to the other games in the series. At the end, everything will be averaged out to get our final result. And oh yeah, spoilers ahead. Centuries ago, Hyrule was ravaged by evil forces until the Picori, a race of tiny creatures, bestowed a young hero Gustav with the Picori Blade and the Light Force. Using both to trap the world's evil in a chest, Gustav would become then known as the Hero of Men. The grateful people of Hyrule would hold an annual Picori festival, with legends stating that a door between their worlds would open every 100 years, allowing the Picori to return. In the present, Link accompanies Princess Zelda to the Picori Festival. The festival's sword-fighting champion, Vati, destroys the Picori Blade and opens the chest, releasing monsters across Hyrule. Not finding the light force he seeks, Vati turns Zelda to stone and leaves. As only children can see the Picori, King Dultist orders Link to find them, so that the sword can be reforged to stop Vati and restore Zelda. Traveling to Minish Woods, Link encounters Eslo, a magical hat who decides to accompany Link and grant him the ability to shrink to Picori size. The Picori, who call themselves Minish, then task Link with retrieving the 4 elements, magic stones needed to restore the Picori Blade. During the journey, Eslo explains that he was once a Minish sage who created the Mage's Cap, a hat capable of granting wishes, but his apprentice Vati stole the hat and became a powerful sorcerer. Fascinated by evil and seeking the Light Force's power, Vati used his new abilities to trap Eslo in his current form. Meanwhile, Vati brainwashes King Dultist and takes control of Hyrule Castle. Link eventually retrieves the 4 elements and infuses them into the reforged blade, which became known as the Four Sword. Link and Eslo also learn that the Light Force is passed down by Hyrule's princesses. Vati, who has been spying on them, overhears this and begins siphoning the Light Force from Zelda. Link returns to the castle and confronts Vati, who uses the extracted Light Force to become all-powerful. But Link overcomes Vati and restores Zelda to normal. Vati transforms into a demonic form only to be vanquished by Link, restoring Eslo to normal. Zelda retrieves the Mage's Cap and uses it to undo all the damage done by Vati, destroying the cap in the process. Eslo thanks Link for his help, giving him a new hat as a parting gift, and he departs through the door to the Minish Realm as it seals itself for another century. The story gets a 3 out of 5. The Minish Cap for a Zelda story is perfectly adequate. It sets up nicely with the lore about the Hero of Men, the Picori, and the Light Force, which adds a nice bit of mystique to all the elements in play during the game's story. Vati is given an interesting, albeit brief, backstory and motivation, being a Minish who is fascinated with the evil hearts of men. He at least feels relevant and somewhat present during the game, making a few appearances to wreak havoc on you or the people of Hyrule. The ending of the game does feel like it wraps up a bit too quickly. Vati is defeated and Zelda just wishes everything back to normal, and it's just like, okay, we're done here, bye. I feel like we needed a post-credit celebration sequence or something like we see in Ocarina of Time. So while this is certainly not one of the top stories told in a Zelda game, I think it sits nicely at the middle score of a 3. The world of Hyrule in the Minish Cap feels a little more compact than other Zelda games. The map hosts several key areas including Hyrule Town, Mount Crenel, the Minish Woods, and the Castor Wilds, with many of these main areas also hosting their own dungeons. The unique touch of Minish Cap is that areas within the overworld have specific sections that Link can only visit in Minish form. Some areas are easier to get to than others, but it's usually worth shrinking down to size to investigate. Hyrule Town is perhaps one of the most fleshed out versions of it in the series, with plenty to do in terms of both the main quest and side content. The world gets a 3 out of 5. While the Minish Cap doesn't make the absolute most of its overworld, it still serves its purpose well. There are many areas to explore and navigating around is pretty seamless. It does feel a bit smaller than most Zelda overworlds and doesn't offer much in the way of unique areas aside from the Castor Wilds in the sky. The art style of the Minish Cap to me is if you took the Wind Waker and turned it into 2D sprites, and for that, I quite like it. Aside from just Toon Link, we definitely get a glimpse of some familiar entities from Wind Waker and see them in 2D form. My absolute favorite part of the visuals in the Minish Cap is when we explore areas in Minish size. The excellent sprite work shows off the sense of scale incredibly well to really immerse you into feeling like your character is small in this massive world. The art style gets a 4 out of 5. Minish Cap has a very impressive style that is fun to look at, but doesn't quite reach a 5 for me. There's a lot of tough competition when it comes to Zelda games and visuals. The closest fair comparison would be A Link to the Past, and the art style to me just edges out Minish Cap by a little bit, but that's just my personal preference. Your main method of attack in the Minish Cap is using the Picori Blade in its various incarnations as you upgrade it into the Four Sword. Aside from standard attacks, you can learn several sword techniques to enhance your combat abilities. Some abilities include a spin attack, rock breaker, and the downward thrust. The central ability for your sword is being able to make phantom copies of Link. There are special platforms in various areas where Link can temporarily create copies to enhance his combat ability or to solve puzzles such as moving really large blocks. As you collect more elements from dungeons and upgrade your blade, you'll be able to make additional copies of Link each time, capping out at 3. While the concept is pretty novel for a single-player Zelda game, trying to maneuver around with 3 additional copies of Link can be really touchy. If one of your copies runs through an object, all of the copies will disappear and you will have to start over. One particular puzzle in the Palace of Winds took me way too many tries because of how sensitive the copies are to touching objects, and it just got really annoying. So while in concept this power is cool, there are a lot of situations where I found it to be not very fun. I previously talked about going down to Minish size and entering specific areas you can only access that way, but a lot of the time you'll be Minish size in the regular world or dungeons. This is another area where things can be touchy. Thankfully there's not too many sections where you have to do something like platforming, but areas where you do have to be more precise can also be a little annoying. It's not easy to have full control when you're just this 2-pixel looking character. The biggest highlight for gameplay for me personally is rolling. The early 3D games are famous for how fast rolling around with Link is, so I really appreciated seeing this incorporated into a 2D game because we don't see it too often. I just find it so much fun rolling around Hyrule Field, but maybe that's just me. Gameplay gets a 4 out of 5. Minish Cap has one of the more versatile and in-depth controls for a 2D Zelda. It's really only held back by some annoyances with controlling Link's four-sword ability and some sections where you are Minish size. Otherwise, the gameplay and combat feels pretty tight. Minish Cap's gallery of items is about as standard as it gets. Nearly every item in your arsenal is something we've seen before up until this point in the series, such as the lantern, Pegasus Boots, and Rock's Cape. There are 3 wholly original items for this game though. The first is the Gust Jar, which can suck in objects to it, as well as shoot out air. Many times it's used to stretch an object to you and help you propel across gaps, but you can also use it to help gain momentum and move forward when floating on a lily pad. The second item is the Cane of Pachi, which has a strange power of being able to flip objects over. A lot of times this will be used to flip jars over that will then give you a platform to turn Minish size. It also flips things like minecarts, and by using it on an empty hole and then having Link go in it, it will let you bounce up to higher areas. Not sure about the logic on that, but I'll take it. The third item is the Mole Mitts that let you enter certain caves and dig through stone. There are a few bonus items that you can get, such as the light arrows and another item I'll cover later. Items get a 2 out of 5. Minish Cap has one of the more generic feeling gallery of items compared to previous and future entries. The 3 new items it introduces are not exactly the most exciting. Items like the Rock's Cape do make a welcome return, and none of the items are straight up unfun to use, but this category does get a bit of a lower score for feeling like it lacks some originality. Fittingly, given the gimmick of this game is to shrink to a small size, the Minish Cap is a rather small game hosting only 6 dungeons. Deepwood Shrine is the opening dungeon, and I think it does a stellar job of setting expectations. You do the entire dungeon in Minish size and the atmosphere fits, with the enemies being things that would normally be tiny to Link, like flies and caterpillars. Objects that would normally be of less significance, like a barrel, end up being a central and pivotal object to navigating the dungeon. This dungeon perfectly executes how the vibes are a little different when you're in Minish size. Cave of Flames is a dungeon that you do mostly in normal size, which I appreciate how the game switches things up. This fire and mineshaft themed dungeon has a number of minecart and platforming puzzles. There's quite a bit of gliding around using Ezlo over treacherous lava as well. The Fortress of Winds has an interesting temple-like theming. This one is definitely a step up in difficulty and has a number of tricky puzzles and traps to look out for. This dungeon focuses heavily on the play between different floors of the dungeon, where either yourself or a small key will have to fall through the holes in the floor to further progression. The Temple of Droplets is the second and final dungeon in the game that is done in full Minish form. The dungeon has a unique layout in that you acquire the boss key and get to the main key item very early on. But from there, your object is to melt the ice to get to the ice element that you need, which does eventually lead to the boss. The music and atmosphere of this dungeon really sells it for me. It just has this mysterious allure to it. While the key item of the lantern is kinda lame for a dungeon item this far into the game, the puzzles are still a lot of fun, and of course we get some amazing classic ice block puzzles. The Palace of Winds is one doozy of a dungeon, and it's one that definitely feels way longer than it actually is. One of the reasons I believe is because you open the boss door and the dungeon just keeps going for a while. When I actually looked back at the footage though, I don't think the dungeon took me too much longer than the Temple of Droplets. Palace of Winds is probably the most difficult dungeon in the game. There's a lot of gliding around and platform maneuvering. Between the various wind puzzles and enemy placements, it's extremely easy to take fall damage. You keep scaling higher and higher up the palace until you finally reach the boss. Dark Hyrule Castle certainly doesn't mess around either. The dungeon is littered with the game's toughest enemies. You will soon find yourself in tight quarters taking on 2 Dark Nuts at once. Some of the toughest challenges are puzzles that utilize the 4-sword ability and having to strike back projectiles at the statues shooting them, or having to walk very precisely through a section and not letting any of your copies take a hit. Dungeons get a 3 out of 5. Minish Cap's lineup of dungeons is good, but I don't think any one dungeon goes above and beyond to hit that upper echelon of Zelda dungeons. I personally think that Temple of Droplets is the best dungeon in this game, but doesn't quite hit that top tier status for me. It also doesn't help that with only 6 dungeons, It has one of the smallest dungeon lineups in the series. That being said, there's not a single bad dungeon in the game either. The Minish Cap has a very large variety of enemies. I appreciate how when you are Minish sized, the gallery of enemies completely changes. You'll have anything from caterpillars, slugs, to flies that drop poop on you. Outside of that, we have enemies you don't see too often like Keatons and even a Lakitu of all things. It was really nice to see Darknuts return in a 2D Zelda game, and they definitely live up to how you had to fight them in the original Legend of Zelda, having to hit them from behind or the side. Thankfully, they don't put you in a room with 10 of them like they did in the original. One enemy that definitely feels out of place to me though is the Moblins. They borrow heavily from the Wind Waker design and it just feels out of place to me. I know the Choo-Choos and Darknuts also take inspiration from Wind Waker, but their design fits the Minish Cap aesthetic much better. Having pig-like Moblins in a game that canonically is supposed to take place before Ganondorf ever existed just doesn't sit right with me. Moving on to the bosses, the first major boss is the Big Green Choo-Choo. While not a very complex boss, I really enjoyed how they made what is normally a pretty unthreatening enemy so much more intimidating when you're Minish size. I think this worked excellently with the first dungeon. Gleerock is the boss of the Cave of Flames, and while it looks cool, it's not very fun or interesting. You flip its shell with the Cane of Pachi and then walk up its neck to slash it to death. It's not necessarily bad, just not anything to write home about. Mazal is essentially just a reskin of Godan from Wind Waker, but with a Minish mechanic thrown in. While admittedly it does look cool, we have seen this boss time and time again, and even at this point in the series, this would have been at least the third appearance of a boss with a head and two disembodied hands. The Big Octorok doesn't have the same wow factor that the Big Green Choo-Choo has, but again, I appreciate them making what is normally a standard enemy a big boss. This is a much more challenging fight too, and the right amount of difficulty for how far you are into the game. The Georg pair boss fight is quite challenging and fun, and heavily involves jumping around with your Rock's Cape, navigating between the Georgs. This is a pretty fun fight, but man do the projectiles get annoying when you're trying to attack with your 4-sword copies. It's so easy to get caught by one and have to start the whole process over. Nevertheless, I think this is a really cool and creative fight. Lastly, we have Vaati, and he is a major jump in difficulty. He is significantly harder than any previous boss, and you have to run an enemy gauntlet before even getting to him. And yes, there is a time limit, so you can't just take your sweet time against the 3 Darknuts that you have to fight. Thankfully, once you actually get to Vaati, the time limit is gone. Vaati starts with 2 intense phases, one involving destroying his shield of laser eyeballs and then hitting the middle eye, and the other one where you have to discover which side of the surrounding eye shield is the weak spots, and then make the correct pattern of link copies to hit them all at once. Thankfully, you get a break before the last phase where you can stock up on health and items. In the last phase, you have to flip his arms over and destroy them in Minish form before hitting back all his projectiles simultaneously to start damaging his main eye. Bosses and enemies get a 4 out of 5. The Minish Cap has a large variety of standard enemies that change up depending on if you're a Minish form or not. While there is only 6 bosses in the game, they are usually either fun, challenging, or creative, with only 2 bosses not really hitting that mark, but neither of which are outright bad in any way. Well, it's finally time to start talking about Kinstones. Kinstones are the main item tied to side content in the Minish Cap. These tokens come in several different color and shape variations, and you match your half with any of the many characters in the game. When you do, something happens. This can range from a chest appearing somewhere on the map to some NPC getting an idea to write a newsletter. There's no real way to expect what you will get unless you of course look it up online. This side content reminds me a lot of Goddess Cubes, which appeared in a later game, Skyward Sword. It's similar in that you unlock something, but you have to pick up your reward somewhere else. so you can either choose to go out of your way and drop what you were doing to pick up the reward, or remember to get it later. Sometimes fusing a kinstone can literally lead to collecting another kinstone, so it's not usually the most satisfying reward. Not to mention that kinstones take up a large portion of the chest rewards in the overworld and dungeons, so it all summarizes into a not so fun system. Thankfully, not all side content is tied to kinstones, and there are plenty of heart pieces to search for all around Hyrule. You can also learn various sword techniques to improve your combat ability, and of course collect bottles. Minish Cap side content is not just infamous for kinstones, but also 2 other side quests. The figurine quest has been touted by many, including Mr. Dr. Boy, as the worst heart piece in all of Zelda. Go check out his video for a full explanation, but in summary, it's an insanely long grind and money sink where you need a lot of luck, all for a heart piece in a music box. Second is the Mirror Shield. Minish Cap has some cool extra items, including light arrows, which if you don't know how to get them, you will miss them and not be able to get them at all. And the Mirror Shield, which requires you to beat the game, rendering it basically useless. Side content gets a 2 out of 10. While I harped on the poor design of the kinstone system, most of the time it's not that bad, but it definitely gets old fast. I'm glad we haven't seen the kinstones return since this game, and I expect that to stay true in the future. Overall, some really head-scratching decisions with getting extra items and some heart pieces makes for some not so great side content. Minish Cap's music is a joy to listen to, much like most Zelda soundtracks. My personal favorites include the Minish Woods, Dark Hyrule Castle, and the Temple of Droplets. The soundtrack has a nice balance of original tracks and ones that are callbacks to past games. I appreciate the Royal Crypt section using the original Legend of Zelda dungeon theme, one you don't see Zelda calling back to too often. Music gets a 3 out of 5. The Minish Cap soundtrack is perfectly enjoyable, but when it comes to Zelda music, there's a lot of tough competition. I think a 3 fits nicely as it's a perfectly adequate soundtrack for the game, but there just isn't enough to really take it to the next level in my opinion. The Minish Cap for the most part has great pacing and progression. It's a short game that doesn't overstay its welcome. The intro is not long-winded and I feel like you get into the action quickly. There are only a few things holding it back. There's a couple sequences in the main story that require a lot of back and forth in Hyrule Town, and the library sequence goes on a bit too long for my liking. The lead up to the Palace of Winds also feels a bit long, and as previously mentioned, the Palace of Winds itself certainly feels like a bit of a drag towards the end. Overall though, a solid 4 out of 5 for pacing. Not too much holds back this game from being a very enjoyable adventure. I've said for a long time that the Minish Cap is possibly the most perfectly average Zelda game. I don't mean to say that in a negative light either. It's just a very solid game, but I don't think it does anything particularly amazing. That being said, I'm always happy to revisit this one every few years. So we've gone through every category, and here is the recap of each of the scores. The scores average out to a 3.2 out of 5. We've covered several other Zelda games, including Breath of the Wild, A Link to the Past, and Twilight Princess in previous videos. So here is where we stand with all of the games. As we rate each game, we will continue to populate this list and slowly build the ultimate Zelda series ranking. Make sure to let me know in the comments how you would rank the Minish Cap, and thank you for watching.